My Alpha King, your mother is alive. I saw her locked inside the Queen's Tower of the Mad. The winter wind cut through the streets of Boston like a blade, carrying with it the scent of snow and ash from the chimneys that dotted the colonial-era buildings. Eleanor pressed herself against the cold stone wall of the narrow alleyway, her breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she watched the guards march past, their boots echoing against the cobblestones. She had seen something she shouldn't have, something that would change everything. 3 days ago, Eleanor had been nothing more than a servant in the household of Lord Marcus Wellington, one of the most powerful men in the Massachusetts colony. She scrubbed floors, carried water, and kept her head down, as girls like her always did. But curiosity had always been her weakness, and when she'd overheard whispers about the mysterious tower on the Wellington estate, the one they called the Queen's Tower of the Mad, she couldn't resist investigating. If you're enjoying this story, please subscribe and leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. What she'd found there still haunted her. Through a narrow window, high up in the tower's stone walls, she had glimpsed a woman's face, gaunt, pale, but unmistakable. Lady Catherine Blackwood, the mother of the young King William Blackwood, who everyone believed had died of fever 5 years ago. Eleanor's hands had trembled as she'd recognized the woman from the portrait that hung in the town hall, a painting commissioned before her supposed death. But this woman was alive, her eyes desperate and hollow, her lips moving in silent pleas that no one could hear. Now, Eleanor stood before the iron gates of the Blackwood estate, the king's winter residence in Boston. Getting here had taken every ounce of courage she possessed. The guards looked down at her with suspicion, their hands resting on the hilts of their swords. She was just a servant girl, after all, with mud on her skirts and no appointment to speak of. "I need to see the king," she said, forcing her voice to remain steady. "I have information about Lady Catherine Blackwood." The guards exchanged glances, and one of them laughed, a cruel, dismissive sound. "The king doesn't take audiences with street urchins. Be off with you before we have you arrested for wasting our time." "Please," Eleanor insisted, stepping closer despite the warning looks. "His mother is alive. I saw her myself, locked in the tower at the Wellington estate. She's been there for years. Enough." The guard's voice was sharp now, angry. "Lady Catherine died of fever. Everyone knows this. If you spread such lies, you'll find yourself in the stocks, or worse. Now go." Eleanor's throat tightened with frustration, but she refused to move. She had come too far to give up now. "Then let me speak to someone who will listen. A steward, an advisor, anyone. I'm telling the truth." Before the guard could respond, a voice called out from behind them. "What's all this commotion?" Eleanor turned to see a tall man approaching, his dark coat marking him as someone of importance. His face was weathered but kind, and his eyes held the sharp intelligence of someone who missed very little. This was Thomas Ashford, the king's most trusted advisor, though Eleanor didn't know it yet. "Just a girl making wild claims, sir," the guard explained. "Says the late queen is alive and locked in a tower. Madness, clearly." Thomas studied Eleanor carefully, his gaze lingering on her face. There was something in her eyes, a desperate sincerity that couldn't be easily dismissed. "What's your name, girl?" "Eleanor, sir. Eleanor Webb. I worked at the Wellington estate. 3 days ago, I saw Lady Catherine Blackwood in the tower they call the Queen's Tower of the Mad. She's alive, sir. I swear it on my life." The words hung in the cold air between them. Thomas's expression didn't change, but Eleanor saw something flicker in his eyes, recognition, perhaps, or suspicion. He gestured to the guards. "Let her through. I'll speak with her myself." "Sir, surely you don't believe—" "I said let her through." The guards stepped aside reluctantly, and Thomas led Eleanor through the gates and into the warmth of the estate. The interior was a stark contrast to the bitter cold outside. Fires blazed in enormous hearths, and tapestries depicting scenes of colonial life hung from the walls. Eleanor's worn shoes squeaked against the polished wooden floors as she followed Thomas down a long corridor. "Tell me everything," Thomas said once they were alone in a small study. "And don't leave out any details, no matter how small they might seem." Eleanor took a deep breath and began her story. She told him about the whispers she'd heard among the other servants, about the tower that no one was allowed to approach, about Lord Wellington's strange comings and goings. She described the night she'd finally worked up the courage to investigate, how she'd climbed the old oak tree near the tower's western wall and peered through the high window. "She was sitting on a small cot," Eleanor said, her voice trembling with the memory. "Her hair was gray and tangled, but I recognized her face from the portrait. She was thinner, older, but it was her. I'm certain of it. She was speaking to herself, or perhaps praying. I couldn't hear the words, but I saw her lips moving. And then she looked up, right at me, and our eyes met." Thomas leaned forward, his hands clasped together. "Did she say anything? Make any gesture?" She pressed her hand against the window, as if trying to reach me. There were tears on her face. And then I heard footsteps. The guards were making their rounds. I had to leave before they saw me. "And why did you risk coming here? You must have known the danger." Eleanor met his gaze steadily. "Because if it were my mother locked away, forgotten by the world, I'd want someone to speak up for her. King William deserves to know the truth." Thomas was silent for a long moment, weighing her words. Finally he stood. "Wait here. Do not leave this room, do you understand? What you've told me is dangerous, Eleanor. If you're wrong, or if you're lying, it could cost you your life. But if you're right—" He paused, his expression grave. "If you're right, then there are people in this colony who have committed a crime beyond measure." Eleanor nodded, though fear coiled in her stomach like a snake. She watched Thomas leave, the door closing behind him with a soft click. Alone in the study, surrounded by books and maps and the trappings of power, she realized just how far she'd come from the scullery of the Wellington estate. There was no turning back now. Hours passed. The fire in the study burned low, and Eleanor added more wood, her hands shaking slightly. She thought about what she'd seen in that tower, about Lady Catherine's desperate eyes. What had happened to her? Why had Lord Wellington imprisoned her? And why had everyone been told she was dead? The door opened suddenly, and Eleanor jumped to her feet. But it wasn't Thomas who entered. It was a younger man, perhaps 25, with dark hair and piercing blue eyes. He wore fine clothes, a deep blue coat with silver buttons, and there was something commanding in the way he carried himself. This had to be King William Blackwood. "Is it true?" he asked without preamble, his voice rough with emotion. "Did you see my mother?" Eleanor curtsied awkwardly, her heart racing. "Yes, Your Majesty. I saw her with my own eyes. She's alive." William closed the distance between them in 3 long strides. Up close, Eleanor could see the exhaustion etched into his features, the dark circles under his eyes. He looked like a man who hadn't slept properly in years. "Tell me everything. Every single detail." So Eleanor told her story again, this time with even more care. She described the tower's location, the iron bars on the windows, the sound of chains she'd heard scraping against stone. She told him about his mother's face, about the recognition she'd seen there when their eyes met. "She knew someone was watching," Eleanor said softly. "I think she was trying to tell me something, but I couldn't hear her. I'm sorry, Your Majesty. I should have found a way to get closer, to speak with her. No." William's voice was firm but not unkind. "You did more than anyone else has done in 5 years. You came here, knowing the risks. That took courage." He turned away, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. Eleanor could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his jaw tightened as he fought to control his emotions. They told me she died of fever. I was 20 years old, and I believed them. I believed Lord Wellington when he said she'd been sick for weeks, that the physicians had done everything they could. I stood at her funeral and grieved for her. And all this time, his voice broke. All this time, she's been locked in that tower. I'm so sorry, Eleanor whispered. William spun back to face her, his eyes blazing. Don't apologize. You've given me something I thought I'd lost forever, hope. But now we need proof, evidence that can't be denied. Lord Wellington is one of the most powerful men in Massachusetts. He has allies, resources, influence. If we accuse him without proof, he'll destroy us both. Thomas, who had been standing quietly near the door, stepped forward. We need to move carefully. Wellington has connections to the governor, to half the landowners in the colony. One wrong step, and this becomes a political disaster. I don't care about politics, William said sharply. I care about my mother. Which is precisely why we need to be smart about this, Thomas countered. If Wellington gets wind of our suspicions, he could move her, or worse. We need to gather evidence first, build an undeniable case. William paced the room like a caged animal, his mind clearly racing. Finally, he stopped and looked at Eleanor. Can you get back into the Wellington estate? Can you get close enough to that tower to find proof? Eleanor's mouth went dry. The thought of returning there, of risking discovery, terrified her. But she thought of Lady Catherine's face, of the desperation in her eyes. I can try, she said, but I'll need help. The guards watch that tower constantly. I won't be able to get inside alone. You won't be alone, William said. I'll send men I trust, people who can create distractions, who can help you get close. But Eleanor... He gripped her shoulders gently, his eyes intense. If you're caught, I won't be able to protect you immediately. Wellington will move too fast. You'll need to be smart, careful. Can you do this? Eleanor swallowed hard, then nodded. For your mother, Your Majesty, I'll do whatever it takes. 2 days later, Eleanor found herself back at the Wellington estate, her heart hammering as she walked through the servants' entrance. She'd been gone for 3 days, and she'd concocted a story about a sick aunt to explain her absence. The head housekeeper had been suspicious, but ultimately accepted her return. Good servants were hard to find, after all. The estate felt different now, charged with a new energy that made Eleanor's skin prickle. She knew things she hadn't known before, secrets that burned in her chest like hot coals. Every time she saw Lord Wellington striding through the halls, his face composed and regal, she wanted to scream the truth at him. But she kept her head down and her mouth shut, biding her time. King William's men had infiltrated the estate in various guises. There was a new stable hand, a traveling merchant who'd been granted permission to set up a small shop in the estate's courtyard, and a musician hired to play at Lord Wellington's upcoming dinner party. They communicated through coded messages. A handkerchief left in a specific window meant the coast was clear. A particular arrangement of candles signaled danger. On the third night, Eleanor received her signal. The stable hand had created a diversion at the main gate, claiming he'd seen suspicious figures lurking near the property line. Most of the guards had rushed to investigate, leaving only a skeleton crew to watch the inner grounds. Eleanor moved through the darkness like a shadow, her dark cloak helping her blend into the night. The Queen's Tower of the Mad loomed before her, its stones dark and forbidding against the winter sky. Her hands trembled as she approached the heavy wooden door at its base. It was locked, as she'd expected. But the musician, a man named James who'd served in the king's personal guard, had taught her how to pick simple locks. Eleanor pulled out the thin metal tools he'd given her and set to work, her fingers clumsy at first, but gradually finding the rhythm. The lock clicked open with a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the quiet night. The tower's interior was cold and smelled of damp stone and something else. Illness, perhaps, or simply neglect. A narrow spiral staircase wound upward into darkness. Eleanor lit the small candle she'd brought and began to climb, counting her steps to calm her racing heart. The stairs seemed to go on forever, up and up until her legs burned, and her breath came in short gasps. Finally, she reached a landing with a single iron door. This lock was more complex, and Eleanor's hands shook as she worked the picks. Minutes passed like hours, and sweat beaded on her forehead despite the cold. Finally, mercifully, the lock gave way. Eleanor pushed the door open slowly, wincing at the creak of old hinges. The room beyond was small and sparsely furnished. A cot, a small table, a single chair. And in the corner, wrapped in a threadbare blanket, sat Lady Catherine Blackwood. The woman's head snapped up at the sound of the door, her eyes wide with fear. In the candlelight, Eleanor could see how much the years had ravaged her. She was thin to the point of frailty, her hair more gray than brown, her skin pale as parchment. But her eyes, those eyes were still sharp, still aware. "Who are you?" Lady Catherine's voice was rough from disuse, barely more than a whisper. Eleanor crossed the room quickly and knelt beside her. "My name is Eleanor Webb, your ladyship. I'm here on behalf of your son, King William. He knows you're alive. He's coming for you." For a moment, Lady Catherine simply stared at her, as if unable to comprehend the words. Then tears began to stream down her face, and she reached out with shaking hands to grip Eleanor's arms. "William? My William knows?" "Yes, my lady. He sent me to find proof, to gather evidence so he can confront Lord Wellington." "Can you tell me what happened? Why did Wellington imprison you here?" Lady Catherine's expression hardened, grief giving way to anger. "Because I discovered his plans. 5 years ago, I learned that Marcus was embezzling funds from the royal treasury, that he was planning to seize control of the colonial government through blackmail and manipulation. I confronted him, told him I would expose him to William." She paused, her voice trembling. "He couldn't kill me. That would have raised too many questions. So he arranged for me to die of fever. I was drugged, declared dead, and buried in an empty coffin while I was brought here. I've been trapped in this tower ever since, a ghost in my own life." Eleanor felt rage building in her chest. "We're going to get you out of here. William is preparing everything. We just need evidence, documents, anything that proves what Wellington has done." "There are documents," Lady Catherine said urgently. "In Wellington's study, hidden behind a loose stone in the fireplace. Financial records, correspondence with co-conspirators. He thinks I don't know, but I've heard him talking to his associates when they visit. He keeps everything there. Insurance against betrayal." Eleanor committed the information to memory. "I'll tell the king. We'll get those documents, and then we'll come for you. Can you hold on a little longer?" Lady Catherine's grip tightened on Eleanor's arms. "Tell my son. Tell William that I never stopped fighting. Tell him I love him, and that I'm so proud of the man he's become." "I will, my lady. I promise." Eleanor heard voices in the distance, the guards returning from their investigation. She had to leave now, before she was discovered. She squeezed Lady Catherine's hands one last time, then rushed back down the spiral stairs, her candle flickering wildly. She managed to lock both doors behind her and disappear into the shadows just as the guards rounded the corner, their torches casting dancing light across the courtyard. The next evening, Lord Wellington hosted his dinner party, a grand affair with music, dancing, and enough wine to drown a small army. Eleanor served tables alongside the other servants, her movements practiced and efficient. But her mind was elsewhere, focused on the task ahead. James, the musician, played a lively tune on his violin, his fingers dancing across the strings. Across the room, the stable hand carried trays of food, his eyes constantly scanning for threats. And Eleanor herself moved through the crowd like a ghost, waiting for her moment. That moment came when Lord Wellington stood to make a toast, drawing all eyes to himself. Eleanor slipped away from the dining hall and made her way to Wellington's study. The door was locked, but James had taught her well. Within seconds, she was inside, closing the door softly behind her. The study was exactly as Lady Catherine had described it. A large room dominated by a massive oak desk and floor-to-ceiling bookshelves. The fireplace was cold now, its stones dark with soot. Eleanor approached it carefully, running her hands over the stones until she found one that shifted slightly under pressure. Her heart leapt. She worked the stone free, revealing a hollow space behind it. Inside were several leather-bound journals and stacks of papers tied with string. Eleanor pulled them out carefully, her hands shaking with excitement and fear. Even a quick glance at the contents confirmed everything. Financial records showing systematic theft from the royal treasury, letters detailing plots to manipulate colonial politics, and most damning of all, a handwritten note from Wellington describing his plan to imprison Lady Catherine. Eleanor stuffed the documents inside her cloak and replaced the loose stone. She was halfway to the door when she heard footsteps in the corridor outside. Heavy, purposeful footsteps that stopped right outside the study. The door swung open and Lord Wellington stood there, his face twisted with rage. "I knew someone had been to that tower," he said coldly. "The lock was picked. Very sloppy work, girl." Eleanor backed away, her mind racing. Wellington stepped into the room and closed the door behind him, cutting off any chance of escape. "You should have minded your own business. Now you'll join Lady Catherine in that tower, and eventually, everyone will forget you both ever existed." "The king knows," Eleanor said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I've already told him everything. Even if you lock me away, he'll come for his mother." Wellington laughed, a cruel, bitter sound. "The king is a child playing at power. Without proof, he has nothing. And soon, when I've consolidated my position, even he will have to bow to me." "But I have proof," Eleanor said, pulling the journals partially from her cloak. "Financial records, letters, everything you've done. The king will see these, and then—" Wellington lunged forward with surprising speed, grabbing for the documents. Eleanor dodged and ran for the door, but Wellington caught her arm, his grip like iron. They struggled, papers scattering across the floor. Eleanor kicked and clawed, fighting with desperate strength. The door burst open, and suddenly the room was full of people. King William stood at the threshold, flanked by his guards and Thomas Ashford. Behind them, Eleanor could see James and the stable hand, their cover finely blown but their purpose served. "Let her go, Wellington," William commanded, his voice carrying the full weight of royal authority. Wellington released Eleanor but didn't retreat. "You have no authority here, boy. This is my estate, my territory. And that woman in the tower is my mother, you treasonous bastard." William's voice was steel wrapped in silk. "Eleanor risked her life to expose you. Now I have all the proof I need to see you hang for your crimes." Guards moved forward to seize Wellington, but the older man wasn't finished. "If you arrest me, half the colonial government will rise against you. I have allies, William. Men who owe me favors. Men who fear what I know about them. You'll tear this colony apart." "Then we'll rebuild it," William said simply, "without corrupt men like you at its foundation." Wellington was led away in chains, still shouting threats and promises of revenge. But Eleanor barely heard him. She was focused on William, on the mixture of emotions playing across his face. Relief, rage, grief, and hope all tangled together. "Thank you," William said to Eleanor once Wellington was gone. "You've given me back something I thought I'd lost forever. How can I ever repay you?" Eleanor shook her head. "Just for your mother, Your Majesty. That's all the thanks I need." The rescue of Lady Catherine Blackwood was carried out that same night. William insisted on going personally, with Eleanor at his side to guide them. They found her exactly where Eleanor had left her, weak but alive, her eyes lighting up when she saw her son for the first time in 5 years. William fell to his knees beside her cot, taking her hands in his and pressing them to his forehead. Neither of them spoke at first. There were no words adequate for such a reunion. They simply held each other and wept, 5 years of grief and separation pouring out in tears. Eleanor stepped back to give them privacy, her own eyes burning. She'd done it. Against all odds, against all logic, she'd reunited a mother and son who'd been torn apart by greed and ambition. The journey back to the Blackwood estate was slow. Lady Catherine was weak from years of imprisonment and poor nutrition, and she had to be carried on a litter. But she was free, truly free, and that knowledge seemed to lend her strength. By the time they reached the estate, she was sitting up, her eyes taking in the winter landscape, as if seeing it for the first time. News of her return spread through Boston like wildfire. People gathered in the streets, weeping and cheering, celebrating the return of their beloved former queen. There was anger, too, at Wellington, at those who had helped him, at the corruption that had allowed such a crime to occur. William promised a full investigation, sweeping reforms to prevent such abuses of power in the future. Wellington and his co-conspirators were tried and convicted of high treason. The evidence Eleanor had recovered was damning beyond any doubt. Wellington's execution was carried out in the spring, as the first flowers began to bloom in Boston's gardens. Eleanor didn't attend. She had no stomach for such things, but she felt a grim satisfaction knowing that justice had been served. In the months that followed, Eleanor's life changed in ways she never could have imagined. William insisted that she be given a position in the royal household, not as a servant but as a lady-in-waiting to his mother. Eleanor protested at first. She was just a servant girl after all, with no training in courtly manners. But Lady Catherine would hear none of it. "You saved my life," Catherine said simply. "You risked everything when you had nothing to gain. That kind of courage is rare, Eleanor. I want you by my side." So Eleanor found herself learning to navigate the complex world of colonial high society. She stumbled at first, making mistakes that would have horrified her weeks earlier. But Catherine was patient, and gradually Eleanor began to find her footing. She discovered that she had a talent for organization and a keen eye for detail that made her invaluable in managing the household. More importantly, she formed genuine friendships. Lady Catherine treated her like a daughter, and William came to value her counsel. She was there when Catherine took her first uncertain steps out of the estate, still fearful that someone might try to imprison her again. She held Catherine's hand as they walked through Boston streets, showing her all the changes that had occurred during her imprisonment. Spring turned to summer, and summer to fall. Lady Catherine grew stronger with each passing day, regaining the weight she'd lost and beginning to resemble the woman in the portrait once more. But there were scars that would never fully heal. Nightmares that woke her in the middle of the night, moments of panic when she felt trapped or confined. Eleanor was there for all of it, offering comfort and companionship. They would sit together in the garden, Catherine embroidering while Eleanor read aloud from the latest books. They talked about everything and nothing. Catherine's memories of William as a boy, Eleanor's childhood in the countryside before she'd come to Boston, their shared hopes for the future. William, too, was changed by the ordeal. He threw himself into the work of governing with renewed purpose, determined to root out corruption wherever he found it. He established new oversight systems for the Treasury, created mechanisms for citizens to report abuses of power, and personally reviewed the cases of everyone imprisoned in the colonial jails to ensure no one else was being held unjustly. He consulted frequently with Eleanor, valuing her perspective as someone who had experienced life at every level of society. "You understand things I never could," he told her once. "You know what it's like to be powerless, to be invisible. That makes you invaluable." Eleanor found herself playing an increasingly important role in the colonial government. She advocated for better conditions for servants and workers, pushed for education programs that would give children from poor families opportunities for advancement, and helped establish a fund to support women who found themselves in difficult circumstances. It wasn't always easy. There were those in Boston's high society who looked down on her, who whispered that she was getting above her station. But with William and Catherine's support, Eleanor weathered the criticism and continued her work. 2 years after that fateful night when Eleanor had first climbed the oak tree and peered through the tower window, Lady Catherine threw a grand celebration. It was officially to mark the anniversary of the colonial charter, but everyone knew it was really about something else, a celebration of survival, of justice, of family reunited. The Blackwood estate was decorated with hundreds of candles, their light warm and welcoming. Musicians played, dancers whirled across the floor, and tables groaned under the weight of food and drink. It seemed like all of Boston had been invited, from the wealthiest merchants to the humblest workers. Eleanor stood at the edge of the ballroom, watching the festivities with a mixture of pleasure and disbelief. How far she'd come from that frightened servant girl who'd stumbled upon a terrible secret. She wore a fine dress now, her hair arranged in the latest fashion, and people treated her with respect bordering on reverence. "You look pensive," William said, appearing at her elbow with 2 glasses of wine. He offered one to her with a smile. "Having regrets?" "Never," Eleanor said firmly, accepting the glass. "I was just thinking about how strange life is. 2 years ago, I was scrubbing floors and carrying water. Now I'm attending balls and advising the king." "You earned every bit of it," William said. "What you did required more courage than any battle I could imagine. You stood up when no one else would. You risked everything for a woman you didn't even know." Eleanor sipped her wine, choosing her words carefully. "I did it because it was right, because your mother deserved to be free, and you deserved to know the truth. I never expected any reward." "I know. That's what makes you remarkable." They stood in comfortable silence, watching Lady Catherine hold court in the center of the room. She was laughing at something one of the guests had said, her face animated and alive in a way that still sometimes surprised Eleanor. The hollow, desperate woman in the tower seemed like a distant nightmare now, though Eleanor knew Catherine still carried those scars. "She's doing well," Eleanor observed. "Thanks in large part to you," William said. "You're the one who sits with her when the nightmares come. You're the one who coaxes her to eat when the memories make her lose her appetite. You're the one who reminds her that she's free, that she's safe. Anyone would do the same. But they didn't. You did." William turned to face her fully, his expression serious. "Eleanor, I want to offer you something. A title, lands, a formal position at court. You've more than earned it." Eleanor's heart clenched. It was a generous offer, more than she'd ever dreamed of receiving. But something held her back. "Can I think about it?" she asked. "Of course. Take all the time you need." The celebration continued late into the night. Eleanor danced with merchants and farmers, with noblemen and scholars. She laughed and talked and celebrated alongside everyone else. But part of her mind was elsewhere, contemplating William's offer and what it would mean. The next morning, Eleanor found Lady Catherine in the garden, tending to a bed of late-blooming roses. The older woman looked up with a smile as Eleanor approached, her hands stained with soil. "Good morning, dear. You're up early after such a late night." "I couldn't sleep," Eleanor admitted. "Catherine, can I ask you something?" "Anything." Eleanor sat on the stone bench beside the roses, gathering her thoughts. "William offered me a title and lands last night. He wants to make my position at court permanent and official." "That's wonderful," Catherine exclaimed. "You deserve every honor he can bestow." "But is it what I want?" The question came out more plaintively than Eleanor had intended. "I love the work I'm doing, helping people who need it. But sometimes I feel like I'm losing myself in all of this. The fine dresses, the formal dinners, the politics. I miss being just Eleanor, you know, the girl who climbed trees and took risks and wasn't afraid to get her hands dirty." Catherine set down her gardening tools and took Eleanor's hands in her own. Then be that girl. The title and lands don't have to change who you are at your core. They're just tools, Eleanor, resources you can use to do even more good in the world. But what if I make mistakes? What if I'm not smart enough, or educated enough, or... You climbed into a tower to free a woman you'd never met, Catherine interrupted gently. You stood up to one of the most powerful men in Massachusetts. You risked your life because you believed it was right. That kind of character doesn't come from education or breeding, Eleanor. It comes from the heart. And your heart is more than strong enough. Eleanor felt tears pricking at her eyes. I'm scared, she admitted. What if I fail? What if I let everyone down? Then you'll pick yourself up and try again, Catherine said firmly. Just like you taught me to do when I was first freed from that tower. Remember? I was so afraid, so convinced that I couldn't reclaim my life. But you wouldn't let me give up. You sat with me every night and reminded me that I was strong, that I had survived the worst and could handle anything else life threw at me. Now I'm returning that favor. You're strong, Eleanor. You're brave. And you're going to do amazing things. Eleanor wiped her eyes and managed a shaky smile. When did you get so wise? I had a lot of time to think in that tower, Catherine said with dark humor. And I had an excellent teacher these past 2 years. They sat together in the garden for a long time, talking about everything and nothing. By the time Eleanor left, she'd made her decision. She would accept William's offer, not because she wanted power or prestige, but because it would give her the resources to help even more people. She would be Lady Eleanor Webb, and she would use her position to make sure that no one else suffered as Catherine had, forgotten and abandoned by those who should have protected them. The ceremony granting Eleanor her title was held on a crisp autumn day. The leaves had turned brilliant shades of red and gold, and the air smelled of wood smoke and apples. Eleanor wore a dress of deep blue velvet, and her hair was adorned with small pearls that caught the light. As she knelt before King William, and he placed the ceremonial sword on her shoulders, Eleanor thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment. From a servant girl to a lady of the court, from powerless to influential, from invisible to seen. It was a transformation that still sometimes took her breath away, but what mattered most wasn't the title or the lands or the recognition. What mattered was the woman standing beside the king, healthy and free and smiling with tears in her eyes. What mattered were the reforms they'd implemented, the people they'd helped, the corruption they'd rooted out. What mattered was the knowledge that she'd stood up when it counted, that she'd risked everything for what was right. After the ceremony, there was another celebration, though smaller and more intimate than the grand ball had been. Eleanor found herself surrounded by friends, true friends, not the fair-weather acquaintances that populated so much of court life. James, the musician who'd helped her infiltrate Wellington's study, played a cheerful tune. Thomas Ashford offered a toast to her courage and character. And William and Catherine stood beside her, the family she'd never expected to have. As the evening wore on and the candles burned low, Eleanor stepped outside for a moment of quiet. The garden was peaceful in the darkness, the only sound the rustling of leaves in the wind. She looked up at the stars, bright and distant in the autumn sky, and allowed herself a moment of pure, uncomplicated happiness. There you are. Eleanor turned to find William approaching, a warm cloak in his hands. You'll catch cold out here, he said, draping it around her shoulders. Thank you. Eleanor pulled the cloak closer, grateful for its warmth. I just needed a moment to breathe, to take it all in. Overwhelming, isn't it? William leaned against the garden wall beside her. I remember feeling the same way when I was crowned, like everything was moving too fast, like I might lose myself in all the ceremony and expectation. Did it get easier? Yes and no. You learn to balance it, the public role and the private person, but it takes time. He paused, then added quietly, Eleanor, I want you to know how grateful I am. Not just for what you did for my mother, but for everything since. You've made this court a better place, made me a better king. You remind me every day why I do this work, what I'm fighting for. Eleanor felt warmth spread through her chest. You give me too much credit. I don't think that's possible. William's voice was soft but sincere. You're remarkable, Eleanor Webb. Don't ever forget that. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the stars and listening to the distant sound of music from the house. In that moment, Eleanor felt something she'd never truly felt before, a sense of belonging, of purpose, of home. Winter came again to Boston, bringing with it snow and cold winds. But inside the Blackwood estate, there was warmth and light and laughter. Eleanor threw herself into her work with renewed energy, using her new position and resources to expand her programs for the poor and disadvantaged. She established schools where children from all backgrounds could learn to read and write. She created apprenticeship programs that gave young people from poor families the chance to learn trades. She advocated tirelessly for fair wages and safe working conditions, using her own experience as a servant to inform her efforts. Not everyone appreciated her work. There were those who thought she was overstepping, who believed that servants and workers should know their place. But Eleanor had learned an important lesson in that tower 2 years ago, that injustice thrived when good people stayed silent. She wouldn't make that mistake again. Lady Catherine was her strongest ally in these efforts. Having experienced firsthand what it was like to be powerless and forgotten, Catherine understood the importance of Eleanor's work in a way that few others could. Together, they became a formidable team, using their combined influence to push through reforms that might otherwise have been blocked. William supported them wholeheartedly, though he warned them to be strategic. Pick your battles, he advised. Change everything at once, and you'll create so much resistance that nothing will happen. But change things gradually, one step at a time, and eventually, you'll transform the entire system. It was wise counsel, and Eleanor took it to heart. She learned to be patient, to compromise when necessary, to build coalitions, and find common ground with even those who opposed her. It was frustrating work at times, slower than she would have liked. But gradually, steadily, things began to change. 3 years after Eleanor had first peered through that tower window, Boston was a different place. Not perfect, far from it, but better, fairer, more just. Workers had legal protections now, children from poor families had access to education, and there were systems in place to prevent the kind of abuse of power that had allowed Wellington to imprison Lady Catherine. Eleanor walked through the city streets on a spring morning, taking in the changes. She passed a new school, its windows bright with sunlight, and heard the sound of children's voices reciting their lessons. She saw a group of workers leaving a factory, laughing and joking, their wages fair and their working conditions safe. She watched a young woman confidently walking into a merchant's shop, applying for a position as a clerk, a job that would have been closed to women just a few years ago. It was progress. Real, tangible progress. And Eleanor had played a part in making it happen. She found herself standing in front of the Wellington estate, which had been confiscated by the Crown after Wellington's execution. The Queen's Tower of the Mad still stood, though it had been transformed. Now it was a library, open to anyone who wanted to learn, with special programs for those who'd never had the opportunity to receive an education. Eleanor climbed the spiral stairs, the same stairs she'd climbed that fateful night, and emerged into the room where Lady Catherine had been imprisoned. It was completely different now. The walls had been painted a cheerful yellow. Bookshelves lined every available surface, filled with volumes on every subject imaginable. Windows that had been barred were now thrown open, letting in fresh air and sunshine. A young girl sat in the corner, deeply absorbed in a book. She looked up as Eleanor entered, and offered a shy smile before returning to her reading. Eleanor smiled back, her heart full. This was what she'd fought for. Not for herself, but for people like this girl. People who deserved every opportunity to grow and learn and thrive. I thought I might find you here. Eleanor turned to find Lady Catherine in the doorway, slightly out of breath from the climb but smiling. I come here sometimes, Eleanor admitted, to remind myself why all of this matters. And Catherine looked around the transformed space, her expression complex. It's strange, isn't it? This room held so much pain for me, but now it's become something beautiful, something that helps people. There's a poetry to that. You don't mind coming here? At first I couldn't, Catherine admitted. Just the thought of these stairs made me feel sick. But gradually, with your help and William's, I've been able to reclaim this space, to transform it in my own mind from a prison to a symbol of hope. It's healing in its own way. They stood together, looking out the window at the city spread below them. From this height, Boston looked peaceful and prosperous, full of promise. Do you ever regret it? Catherine asked suddenly. Taking that risk, changing your life so completely? You could have walked away that night, kept your head down, stayed safe. Eleanor considered the question carefully. No, she said finally. Even on the hardest days, when I'm exhausted and frustrated and wondering if any of this makes a difference, no, I don't regret it. Because I know that I did the right thing. And because of that choice, I've found a family, a purpose, and a way to make the world a little bit better. Catherine squeezed her hand. My son is lucky to have you as an advisor, and I'm lucky to have you as a daughter. Not by blood, perhaps, but in every way that matters. Eleanor felt her eyes burning again. Happy tears this time. I'm the lucky one, she whispered. 5 years after Eleanor Webb had first glimpsed Lady Catherine's face through that tower window, Boston hosted a grand festival. It was meant to celebrate the colony's prosperity and progress, but everyone knew it was really about something else, about survival and redemption, about justice and change, about a servant girl who'd changed the course of history. Eleanor was 32 now, confident and accomplished. She still worked tirelessly for the causes she believed in, but she'd learned to balance that work with joy and friendship and life. She'd learned that you could be both strong and gentle, both ambitious and content, both a fighter and a peacemaker. She stood on the balcony of the Blackwood estate, watching the festivities below. There were games and music, dancing and food, laughter echoing through the streets. People from all walks of life mingled freely, a sight that would have been impossible just a few years ago. William joined her on the balcony, as he so often did during quiet moments. He'd matured over the years, grown into his role as king with grace and wisdom. There were lines around his eyes now, marks of the weight he carried, but there was also peace in his expression. You did this, he said, gesturing to the celebration below. All of this, the changes, the progress, the hope, you made it possible. We did this, Eleanor corrected. You, me, your mother, everyone who believed that things could be better. It was never just one person. Perhaps, but you were the catalyst. You were the one who had the courage to speak up when everyone else stayed silent. William turned to face her fully. Eleanor, there's something I've been wanting to say for a while now. Something I should have said years ago. Eleanor's heart began to beat faster. There was something in William's eyes, something warm and intense that made her breath catch. When you first came to me with your story about my mother, I saw you as brave and loyal, William continued. Over the years, I've come to see so much more. Your intelligence, your compassion, your unwavering commitment to justice. You've become my most trusted advisor, yes, but you've also become my closest friend. And somewhere along the way, without me quite realizing when it happened, you became something more. He took her hands in his touch gentle but firm. I love you, Eleanor, Not as an advisor or a friend, though you're both of those things. I love you as a woman, as a partner, as someone I want to build a future with. I know I'm the king, and you came from humble origins, and there will be people who object. But I don't care about any of that. I care about you. Eleanor felt tears streaming down her face, tears of joy, of disbelief, of overwhelming emotion. William, You don't have to answer now, he said quickly. I know this is sudden. I just wanted you to know how I feel, what you mean to me. No, Eleanor said, finding her voice. I don't need time, because I love you too. I think I have for a long time, but I was afraid to admit it, even to myself. I thought it was impossible, that someone like me could never. William silenced her with a kiss, soft and sweet and full of promise. When they finally pulled apart, Eleanor was laughing and crying at the same time, hardly able to believe this was real. Is that a yes? William asked, his own eyes suspiciously bright. Yes, Eleanor said. Yes, 1,000 times yes. The sound of footsteps made them turn. Lady Catherine stood in the doorway, her hand pressed to her heart, tears streaming down her face. Finally, she said. I've been waiting years for you two to figure this out. William laughed. You knew? Of course I knew. I'm your mother. I see everything. Catherine crossed to them and pulled them both into a fierce embrace. This is what I dreamed of during those years in the tower. Not just freedom, but this, a family whole and happy, a future full of hope. Thank you, Eleanor, for giving me my son back, and for loving him as he deserves to be loved. The three of them stood together on the balcony, arms around each other, watching the celebration below. And Eleanor thought about the journey that had brought her here, from servant to lady, from invisible to invaluable, from alone to surrounded by love. It hadn't been easy. There had been fear and danger, setbacks and obstacles, moments when she'd doubted herself and her choices. But she'd persevered. She'd stayed true to her values and fought for what was right, even when it was hard. And in doing so, she'd not only changed her own life, but the lives of countless others. The sun was setting now, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. In the distance, Eleanor could see the tower that had started everything, no longer a prison, but a library, a beacon of hope and learning. It seemed fitting somehow, a perfect symbol of how darkness could be transformed into light, how pain could become purpose. What are you thinking? William asked softly. Eleanor smiled, leaning into his embrace. I'm thinking about a scared girl who climbed a tree 5 years ago and peered through a window. I'm thinking about how one moment of courage changed everything. And I'm thinking about how grateful I am for all of it, the fear, the risk, the struggle. Because it brought me here, to this moment, with you. No regrets? Not a single one. As darkness fell over Boston, the festival lights began to glow, hundreds of lanterns casting their warm light over the streets. Music drifted up to the balcony, sweet and joyful. And Eleanor stood between the two people she loved most in the world, feeling more content than she'd ever imagined possible. She'd started as a servant girl, with nothing but her courage and her conscience. She'd become a lady, an advisor, a force for change. And now, impossibly, she would become a queen. Not through birth or destiny, but through choice and love, and the simple act of doing what was right. The future stretched before her, full of challenges and opportunities, responsibilities and joys. There would be difficulties ahead. There always were. But Eleanor wasn't afraid. She'd faced down far greater obstacles and prevailed. With William by her side, with Catherine's love and support, with the lessons she'd learned and the strength she'd discovered within herself, she could handle anything. As the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Eleanor made a silent promise to that frightened girl who'd climbed the tree 5 years ago. She promised to always speak up for those who couldn't speak for themselves, to never turn away from injustice, no matter how powerful those who perpetrated it, to use whatever influence and resources she had to make the world a little bit better, a little bit fairer, a little bit kinder. It was a promise she would keep for the rest of her life. And it all started with a single moment of courage, a glimpse through a tower window, and 7 words that changed everything. My Alpha King, your mother is alive.